Today on Save Point, we have over an hour of failed video games to talk about. Sit back, relax, and enjoy as we dive into our first game of the night, Concord. In the world of gaming, every release brings expectations, and Concord was no exception. Developed by Firewalk Studios and backed by Sony, Concord was positioned to be a major multiplayer hero shooter. Announced with fanfare, it was set to compete in a crowded genre dominated by games like Overwatch and Valorant. At its core, Concord promised a fast-paced competitive PvP experience with futuristic aesthetics. However, from the outset, it struggled to stand out. The hero shooter market was already packed with successful titles, and Concord offered little that felt truly unique. Its gameplay, while polished, didn't differ enough from other games in the space, and that would soon become its downfall. Behind the scenes, trouble was brewing. Internal issues at Firewalk Studios came to light when Ryan Ellis, the game's director, stepped down in March 2024, just months before release. This leadership shakeup signaled deeper problems within the studio. Staff turnover and morale issues contributed to a sense of uncertainty about the game's future. When Concord finally launched in the summer of 2024, it was met with a lukewarm reception. Critics noted that while the game wasn't bad, it simply didn't offer anything new. Players quickly lost interest, and the game's PvP-only model meant it relied heavily on maintaining an active player base. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Despite its backing by Sony, Concord only sold around 25,000 copies, with peak concurrent players on Steam barely reaching 660. Player retention, a critical factor in the success of live service games, was also a major issue. Matchmaking times grew longer as the player base rapidly shrank, and there was little buzz or excitement about future updates. Without a solid community to support it, Concord was on a downward spiral just weeks after launch. In September 2024, just 2 months after its release, Sony made the decision to take Concord offline. The game servers were shut down, and any plans for future content were scrapped. It was a swift and significant failure for a game that had once been positioned as a major project for Sony's multiplayer ambitions. Up next is Anthem. When Anthem was first revealed by BioWare and EA, it was met with immense excitement. This shared world shooter was positioned as a major new IP, combining BioWare's signature storytelling with high-octane multiplayer action. At its core, players would control customizable exosuits known as javelins to fly around an alien planet, engage in combat, and explore an open world. However, Anthem quickly became one of the industry's most infamous failures. The game was announced at E3 2017 with a stunning trailer, showcasing fluid movement, impressive visuals, and cooperative gameplay. Fans were eager to dive into this new world, and the buzz around Anthem was strong. But behind the scenes, development was in trouble. Despite BioWare's reputation for delivering quality games like Mass Effect and Dragon Age, Anthem was plagued by mismanagement and a lack of clear direction. Anthem's development cycle was chaotic. The game had been in development for many years, but much of that time was spent on pre-production, with the final version coming together in just 18 months. This resulted in a rushed product that lacked polish. By the time it was ready to launch in February 2019, many features were incomplete and key aspects of the game, such as the story and progression system, felt half-baked. At launch, players quickly noticed Anthem's shortcomings. While the flying mechanics and javelin suits were praised, the game's world felt repetitive and its missions were shallow. Players were expected to grind the same activities over and over without meaningful progression or variety. The loot system, which is critical for games like this, was underwhelming. Many players found that the rewards didn't feel satisfying, and the system lacked the depth seen in other looter shooters like Destiny. Another major issue was the game's technical performance. Anthem was riddled with bugs and server problems at launch, which made it difficult for players to even enjoy the core gameplay. Many reported crashes, lag, and long loading times, all of which contributed to a frustrating experience. BioWare and EA were quick to promise fixes, but these problems severely damaged the game's reputation early on. Content-wise, Anthem also struggled. The story, which was supposed to be one of BioWare's strengths, felt disconnected and lacking in depth. Players had little emotional investment in the characters or the overarching narrative, and the live service model that Anthem was built around didn't help matters. Updates and new content were slow to arrive, leaving players with little to do after completing the base game. Player retention became a serious problem. With little variety in the endgame and ongoing technical issues, Anthem saw a sharp drop-off in its player base. Many who had hoped it would rival other live service games like Destiny 2 and The Division quickly abandoned it. The game's promise of a rich, evolving world fell flat, and BioWare's efforts to address these issues came too late. Behind the scenes, it became clear that Anthem's problems were rooted in its development mismanagement. Reports surfaced that the game's leadership had struggled to maintain a clear vision. With frequent changes in direction and a lack of communication across the team, developers were under immense pressure to meet EA's deadlines, and the game's rushed release left little time for crucial testing and polish. In the months following its launch, BioWare attempted to fix Anthem through patches and updates. A large-scale overhaul dubbed Anthem Next was even announced, with the goal of rebuilding the game from the ground up. However, these efforts never materialized. In early 2021, BioWare officially announced that it would no longer pursue the overhaul, effectively abandoning Anthem. The failure of Anthem had significant repercussions for both BioWare and EA. The studio, once known for its narrative-driven RPGs, faced a major hit to its reputation. Meanwhile, EA had invested heavily in Anthem, hoping it would become a long-term live service title with ongoing revenue from microtransactions and expansions. Instead, it became one of the most notable gaming failures in recent memory. Coming up next, we have Lawbreakers, a fast-paced arena shooter developed by Boss Key Productions and led by Gears of War creator Cliff Bleszinski. Released in 2017, it was supposed to be a fresh take on the competitive shooter genre, but despite the big names involved and its promise of gravity-defying combat, Lawbreakers quickly became a commercial failure. At the time of its launch, the gaming market was saturated with successful multiplayer shooters. Overwatch in particular dominated the hero shooter space with its vibrant characters and accessible gameplay. Lawbreakers tried to position itself differently by offering a more hardcore, skill-based experience. The game was built around fast, precise shooting mechanics and unique movement systems that defied gravity, making combat in the game unlike anything else. However, while Lawbreakers was praised by critics for its innovative mechanics, it didn't catch on with a large audience. One of the biggest reasons for this was timing. Lawbreakers launched in a market where Overwatch had already established itself as the go-to hero shooter, and players were heavily invested in it. The fast-paced, challenging gameplay of Lawbreakers appealed to a niche audience, but it was too niche to compete with Overwatch's broader appeal. Marketing and visibility also played a role in its failure. Despite having a well-known developer attached, Lawbreakers didn't generate the same level of excitement as its competitors. The game struggled to build a large player base from the start, which is a crucial factor in sustaining multiplayer-only titles. With low player numbers, matchmaking became slow, and the community started to dwindle, further contributing to the game's decline. Lawbreakers also made a critical mistake by launching as a paid title. At $30, it wasn't a full-priced game, but it was still a barrier to entry compared to the free-to-play models that were gaining popularity at the time. Games like Fortnite were thriving by adopting free-to-play models with in-game purchases, and Lawbreakers simply couldn't compete. Players were reluctant to spend money on a new, untested game when other popular free alternatives were available. In just a few months, Lawbreakers saw a sharp decline in its player base. Despite positive reviews from the press, the game's community was shrinking fast, and attempts to revive it through updates and patches couldn't bring players back. The team behind Lawbreakers eventually announced that they would no longer be supporting the game, and the servers were shut down in September 2018, a little over a year after its release. Ultimately, Lawbreakers' failure came down to a mix of poor timing, competition, and misreading the market. While it was a mechanically sound game with unique ideas, it couldn't find its place in an overcrowded genre. The decision to charge for the game instead of embracing a free-to-play model only compounded its problems, making it harder to attract and retain players. Next up, we have Crucible. Crucible was Amazon Game Studio attempt to break into the competitive multiplayer market. Released in May 2020, it was a free-to-play, team-based hero shooter with a sci-fi theme. On paper, Crucible seemed like a promising entry into the genre. It had a mix of PvP and PvE elements, allowing players to team up and face off in a variety of game modes. But despite Amazon's vast resources and ambition, Crucible quickly became one of the most notorious failures in recent gaming history. From the start, Crucible faced an uphill battle. The hero shooter genre was already crowded, with games like Overwatch, Apex Legends, and Fortnite firmly entrenched. For Crucible to succeed, it needed to stand out in some meaningful way, but unfortunately it didn't. The game's mechanics felt derivative, and it lacked the polish and identity that its competitors had. While it attempted to blend PvP with PvE, the result was a game that felt unfocused and confused. Another unfortunate issue for Crucible was timing. It launched with little hype in May of 2020 during the height of the global pandemic, when many players were looking for new games to play. However, the launch was so quiet that many gamers didn't even know that it had been released. Marketing for the game was minimal, and there was little buzz or excitement surrounding it. Without a strong push to bring players in, Crucible struggled to build an audience from the outset. Even for those who did try the game, the experience was underwhelming. Players quickly found that Crucible lacked depth. Its gameplay was repetitive, the characters weren't particularly memorable, and the maps and modes didn't offer much variety. There was also a lack of balance between heroes, which made matches feel uneven and frustrating. As a free-to-play game, Crucible needed to hook players and keep them coming back, but it didn't offer enough to make people want to stick around. The technical issues at launch didn't help either. Players reported bugs, server issues, and poor optimization, all of which made the experience even more frustrating. In an already competitive market, these issues made Crucible feel unpolished compared to its rivals. Within a month of its release, the situation became dire. The player base had dropped significantly, and Amazon took the unprecedented step of pulling Crucible back into closed beta, effectively admitting that the game wasn't ready. This move was unusual for a game that had already officially launched, and it raised questions about the future of Crucible. Unfortunately, even in closed beta, Crucible couldn't regain the interest of players. By October 2020, Amazon officially shut down the game less than 6 months after its initial release. Up next is a game that's going to be fun to talk about because it's still being worked on right now. Let's talk about New World. New World was Amazon Game Studios' first major success, at least initially. Released in September 2021, the MMORPG set in a supernatural version of the colonial era drew a lot of attention for its ambitious scale and promise of deep player-driven mechanics. However, despite its strong launch, New World quickly ran into numerous problems that led to a massive drop in its player base. When New World first launched, it was greeted by a large number of players players, eager to explore its vast open world. In its first week, the game had over 900,000 concurrent players, and Amazon touted it as a major victory for the struggling studio. But that success was short-lived. Shortly after launch, cracks began to appear, and New World quickly became a cautionary tale of how an MMORPG can falter even with a strong start. One of the game's biggest problems was endgame content, or rather the lack thereof. While players enjoyed the leveling process, the endgame content was sparse and repetitive. After hitting the level cap, many found there wasn't enough to do, and the game's progression systems didn't offer satisfying long-term goals. For an MMO where player retention is key, this was a critical flaw. Without fresh content to keep players engaged, many left the game soon after reaching endgame. Technical issues also plagued New World from the beginning. Server queues were infamously long during the first few weeks, making it difficult for players to even log into the game. Once they were in, bugs and exploits quickly became a major issue. Players discovered game-breaking glitches that allowed them to duplicate items or gold, completely destabilizing the in-game economy. While Amazon worked to patch these exploits, the damage had already been done, and player trust was beginning to erode. Balancing issues were also another significant problem. New World introduced a mix of PvP and PvE content, but many players felt the PvP in particular was poorly balanced. Wars and large-scale battles, major selling points of the game, often ended in frustration due to bugs and balance problems, which further contributed to the exodus of players. Within a few months of its release, New World went from 900,000 concurrent players to under 100,000, a dramatic drop that signaled deeper problems within the game. The player base shrank, and while Amazon tried to fix bugs and introduce new content, many players had already moved on to other titles. But rather than abandon New World entirely, Amazon Game Studios has been working on a relaunch of the game under a new title, New World Eternum. This relaunch, which began in late 2023, is an attempt to revitalize the game with new content, along with overhauled systems and fresh marketing aimed at both new players and those that had left. The goal is to address the many issues that plagued the original release and offer a more complete, polished experience. New World Eternum brings in new zones, improved PvP systems, and more varied endgame content. Amazon has also focused on fixing many of the technical issues that drove players away in the first place. While early responses to Eternum have been cautiously optimistic, it remains to be seen whether the game can regain the player base it lost during its initial launch. As of now, New World Eternum has managed to draw back a modest amount of players, but it's far from the blockbuster success Amazon originally hoped for. The MMORPG market is incredibly competitive, and New World now faces the challenge of not just bringing back old players, but convincing new ones to give it a try in a market filled with established titles. Up next, let's talk about Marvel's Avengers. Marvel's Avengers had all the ingredients to be a massive hit. Released in 2020 by Crystal Dynamics and published by Square Enix, it featured some of the most popular superheroes in the world, and it had a big budget behind it, and the backing of the Marvel brand. Expectations were sky high for this live service action-adventure game. Unfortunately, Marvel's Avengers ended up being one of the biggest disappointments in recent gaming history. At its core, Marvel's Avengers was meant to offer both a cinematic single-player experience and a multiplayer live service component, allowing players to take on missions together as their favorite Marvel heroes. But from the start, things didn't go as planned. The game had a rocky launch. While the single-player campaign was generally well received for its story and character-driven moments, the live service component, where players were expected to spend most of their time, was riddled with problems. The missions were repetitive, and the loot system, which was supposed to be the backbone of progression, felt very unrewarded. Players were grinding the same types of missions over and over again without feeling like they were making meaningful progress. And the gear system didn't tie into the core superhero fantasy. This was especially problematic for a game based on characters like Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America, who were known for their iconic gear and powers. Another key issue was the game's lack of content. At launch, Marvel's Avengers had a limited number of missions, and the post-launch content updates were slow to arrive. For a live service game that relies on keeping players engaged with regular updates, this was a huge problem. Players quickly found themselves with nothing new to do, and without compelling new content, many just left the game altogether. On top of that, technical issues plagued the game. Bugs and glitches were common, and performance problems on both consoles and PC made the experience frustrating for many players. Marvel's Avengers also struggled with a lack of a strong endgame. For a game built around multiplayer, the endgame content was critical to keep players engaged long term. However, the endgame missions felt like more of the same, with little variety or challenge. The game was also criticized for its microtransaction system. While Marvel's Avengers wasn't a pay-to-win game, the cosmetic items available for purchase were often seen as overpriced and uninspired. This, combined with the slow rollout of new heroes and content, made players feel like they weren't getting enough value for their time or money. Despite attempts to turn things around with post-launch updates and new characters like Spider-Man and Black Panther, it was too little too late. The player base had dwindled significantly, and even major updates failed to bring players back in meaningful numbers. Square Enix eventually acknowledged that the game had underperformed, and in 2022, support for Marvel's Avengers began to wind down with no major new content planned. Ultimately, Marvel's Avengers is remembered as a missed opportunity. While the single-player campaign had its moments, the overall experience failed to capture the excitement and magic that fans fans had hoped for. Up next, we're going to talk about Battleborn. Battleborn was developed by Gearbox Software, the creators of Borderlands, and was released in May 2016. It was a colorful multiplayer first-person shooter with MOBA elements, combining fast-paced combat with team-based strategy. Despite the pedigree of the studio behind it, Battleborn quickly became a commercial failure. When Battleborn was first revealed, it seemed like it had the potential to carve out its own niche into the gaming world. It featured a diverse roster of 25 playable characters, each with unique abilities and playstyles, and mixed traditional shooter mechanics with elements of team-based combat and MOBA-style objective control. The game offered both a campaign and multiplayer modes, giving players a variety of ways to play. However, from the very start, Battleborn faced a significant problem: timing. Just weeks after Battleborn launch, Blizzard released Overwatch, a multiplayer hero shooter that would go on to dominate the genre. The proximity of these releases was disastrous for Battleborn. While Battleborn had its own distinct flavor with more complex mechanics and a focus on cooperative gameplay, Overwatch was more accessible and had a much broader appeal. The simpler, more polished gameplay of Overwatch quickly stole the spotlight, and Battleborn was left struggling to find an audience. Another issue that contributed to Battleborn's downfall was its complicated mechanics. While some players appreciated the depth and variety of its gameplay, others found it overwhelming. The game's mixture of MOBA elements and first-person shooting was a bold idea, but it also made the game harder to understand and play for casual players. In contrast, Overwatch was straightforward and easy to pick up, which gave it a wider reach. Battleborn also suffered from a lack of a strong marketing push. Gearbox and 2K Games didn't manage to create the same level of excitement around Battleborn as Blizzard did with Overwatch. While Overwatch enjoyed a massive marketing campaign, including cinematic trailers and extensive beta testing, Battleborn struggled to generate any hype. It was quickly overshadowed, and many potential players didn't even realize it was a different game from Overwatch due to the similarity in the colorful character-based style. Despite the strong artistic design and unique character roster, Battleborn faced technical issues at launch. Server problems, matchmaking delays, and balance issues frustrated early adopters. These problems made it difficult for Battleborn to retain the players it did manage to attract, and the game's community quickly dwindled. As we've seen in other failed games, another failure was Battleborn's price point. At launch, the game was sold as a full-price title, which set it apart from many other competitive multiplayer games that were either free-to-play or priced much lower. As the player base shrank, the game was later made free-to-play, but by then it was too late. Within a year of its release, Battleborn's player base had dwindled to the point where the game's servers were sparsely populated. Despite the development team's efforts to update the game and introduce new content, there wasn't enough interest to sustain it. In September 2017, Gearbox announced that Battleborn would no longer receive updates, and the game's servers were officially shut down in early 2021. Next, we'll talk about Evolve. Evolve was developed by Turtle Rock Studios, the team behind Left 4 Dead, and released in 2015. It was an asymmetric multiplayer shooter where 4 players controlled hunters and a 5th player controlled a powerful monster. The concept was innovative for its time, with players facing off in an intense 4v1 match where teamwork was essential for success. Despite a promising start, Evolve quickly became a commercial disappointment. At launch, Evolve received a fair amount of hype. The idea of asymmetrical multiplayer where one player could take on the role of a massive evolving creature was appealing to both competitive and cooperative players. Each match started with the hunters tracking down the monster, who grew stronger by consuming wildlife and evolving into increasingly dangerous forms. Meanwhile, the hunters had to work together to bring it down before it became too powerful. Despite this fresh take on multiplayer, Evolve had some serious problems right from the start. One of the biggest issues was its pricing model. The game launched as a full-price title, but it was also packed with an overwhelming amount of DLC. Players felt like they were being nickeled and dimed from the very beginning, with a large number of hunters, monsters, and skins being locked behind paywalls. This created immediate backlash from the gaming community, who felt that the game was monetized unfairly. Instead of embracing the game's core mechanics, much of the conversation around Evolve centered on its pricing structure. Another issue was the game's replayability. While the core concept of 4v1 combat was interesting, it didn't have the depth needed to keep players engaged long-term. Matches became repetitive after a while, with the same environments, limited variety in the monster types, and not enough game modes to keep the experience fresh. Players began dropping off quickly after the initial excitement wore off, and it became harder to find full matches. The lack of substantial content updates also hurt Evolve. In a multiplayer-focused game like this, a steady stream of new content such as maps, characters, and balance updates is crucial to keep the community engaged. While Turtle Rock did release some new monsters and hunters, the slow rollout of content wasn't enough to maintain a healthy player base. In an effort to save the game, Evolve was relaunched as Evolve Stage 2 in 2016, a free-to-play version designed to bring players back by offering all the previously locked content for free. While this shift initially spiked interest, it wasn't enough to sustain the game in the long run. The player base, which had already dwindled, was too small to keep the game alive. Eventually, support for Evolve was discontinued, and the servers for the free-to-play version were shut down in 2018. Up next, let's talk about Scalebound. Scalebound was developed by Platinum Games and published by Microsoft. It was revealed at E3 2014 with a lot of excitement. The game promised an action-packed RPG experience, with players controlling a young protagonist named Drew alongside a massive dragon named Thuban. The combination of fast-paced combat, a dynamic open world, and a dragon companion had players eagerly awaiting its release. However, despite the hype, Scalebound never saw the light of day, and its cancellation in 2017 left fans disappointed and confused. The vision for Scalebound was ambitious. Platinum Games is known for its work on stylish action titles like Bayonetta, so expectations were high. The game's concept of controlling both a human character and a dragon in a seamless cooperative style was something fresh and exciting. Drew, the protagonist, had the ability to issue commands to his dragon companion while engaging in combat himself, creating a unique blend of strategy and action. But behind the scenes, Scalebound faced significant development challenges. From the beginning, the project struggled with technical issues. Creating a game with large open environments and real-time cooperation between a human and a dragon proved to be more difficult than they anticipated. The game ran on Unreal Engine 4, and while that engine is powerful, it presented difficulties for the team, particularly in optimizing the game for the Xbox One's hardware. As development dragged on, reports of tension between Platinum Games and Microsoft began to surface. Platinum Games, a studio that thrives on creative freedom, was reportedly struggling with the demands and expectations set by Microsoft. The relationship between the two companies became strained, and the project's direction began to waver. On top of that, the team at Platinum Games was also just juggling other projects at the time, which further complicated development. Another key factor was the game's multiplayer focus. Scalebound was originally intended to be a single-player RPG, but as development progressed, a co-op multiplayer element was introduced. This shift in direction added further complexity to the game's development and led to more delays. While the idea of playing with friends and controlling dragons sounded appealing, it also put additional strain on the project's resources and design. By early 2017, it became clear that Scalebound was in trouble. After years of development and several delays, the game had not progressed as expected. In January 2017, Microsoft made the difficult decision to cancel the project, officially confirming that Scalebound would no longer be developed. The news shocked fans and industry insiders alike, as it was rare for a project of this scale to be canceled so late in development. The cancellation of Scalebound was a significant blow to both Microsoft and Platinum Games. For Microsoft, it meant losing what could have been a major exclusive for the Xbox One. At the time, the company was struggling to compete with Sony's lineup of PlayStation exclusives, and Scalebound was seen as a potential system seller. For Platinum Games, the cancellation was a rare failure in a portfolio otherwise filled with critically acclaimed titles. Since its cancellation, Scalebound has remained a topic of discussion among fans, with many speculating about what could have been. There have been occasional rumors of the game being revived, but so far nothing concrete has materialized. It seems that both Microsoft and Platinum Games have moved on. Now let's talk about Radical Heights. Radical Heights was developed by Boss Key Productions and released in 2018, just months after the studio's previous game Lawbreakers failed to gain traction. Riding the wave of the battle royale genre, Radical Heights was a last-ditch effort by the studio to stay afloat. Unfortunately, the game's rushed development and poor reception sealed its fate. The game was released in early access only 5 months after development began, which was clear from its unfinished state. Radical Heights had a bright 80s themed aesthetic and unique mechanics like earning cash to buy weapons during the match, but the lack of polish was undeniable. The environments felt incomplete, bugs were rampant, and many core features expected in a battle royale game were missing. It was clear that the game needed more time in development. Despite these shortcomings, Radical Heights managed to attract some initial attention due to the popularity of the genre and its quirky retro style. The game introduced interesting mechanics, and it differentiated itself from other battle royales, but that novelty quickly wore off. The competition in the battle royale space was fierce, with games like Fortnite and PUBG dominating the market, leaving little room for an unfinished, unpolished game like Radical Heights. Just a month after Radical Heights launched, Boss Key Productions announced its closure, unable to recover from the failure of Lawbreakers and the lackluster reception of Radical Heights. With the studio shutting down, the game received no further updates or support, and the player base dwindled rapidly. Radical Heights was ultimately abandoned, and its servers were taken offline soon after. It was a brief, desperate attempt to capture the battle royale audience, but in the end, it couldn't save the game, and unfortunately the studio. Now let's talk about Babylon's Fall. Babylon's Fall was developed by Platinum Games and published by Square Enix, launching in March 2022. Expectations were really high for this live service action RPG. With its fantasy setting, co-op gameplay, and fast-paced combat, Babylon's Fall was positioned as a fresh, multiplayer-driven experience. However, the game quickly became one of the biggest failures in recent gaming history, with its servers shut down less than a year after launch. One of the first things that stood out about Babylon's Fall was its visual style, which Platinum Games described as a brushstroke effect to give it a unique, painterly look. But what was intended to make the game stand out visually became one of its most criticized aspects. Players found the graphics dull and outdated, with many comparing its visuals to games from older console generation. The brushstroke art style didn't resonate with the audience, and it was widely considered a poor fit for a modern live service game. Beyond its visuals, the gameplay itself felt uninspired. Babylon's Fall centered around repetitive hack-and-slash combat with very little variation in mission design. While the game featured co-op multiplayer, there wasn't much depth to the experience. Missions quickly became monotonous, with players fighting waves of of enemies in the same environments with little sense of progression. For a game that was designed to keep players coming back over time, this lack of engaging content became a major issue. Another significant problem was the game's live service model. Babylon's Fall was priced as a full $60 game, but was also packed with microtransactions and cosmetic items that players were expected to purchase. This heavy reliance on in-game purchases frustrated players, who felt like the base game was already lacking in content. The game also failed to attract a large player base at launch, and matchmaking for co-op missions became difficult as player numbers quickly dropped. Technical issues also compounded the problems with Babylon's Fall. Players reported bugs, connectivity issues, and crashes, making an already underwhelming game even harder to play. These issues combined with the lack of excitement surrounding the game led to a sharp decline in interest within weeks of its release. Square Enix did attempt to salvage Babylon's Fall with patches and content updates, but the player base had already dwindled to nearly nothing. By May of 2022, just 2 months after launch, the game had fewer than 10 concurrent players on Steam at time. It was clear that Babylon's Fall had failed to capture the attention of the gaming community. In September 2022, Square Enix announced that it would be shutting down the game's servers in early 2023, less than a year after its launch. Babylon's Fall was widely considered a commercial and critical disaster, with many citing it as an example of how a live service game can quickly fall apart if it doesn't offer a compelling experience. Up next, an infamous title, Daikatana. Daikatana is often remembered as one of the biggest flops in gaming history, largely due to the high expectations surrounding its release. Developed by Ion Storm and led by John Romero, one of the co-creators of Doom and Quake, Daikatana was expected to revolutionize first-person shooters when it was announced in 1997. However, a series of development missteps turned the game into a cautionary tale of overambition and marketing gone wrong. At the time, Romero was a gaming superstar, and Daikatana was positioned as his next big hit. The game was an ambitious first-person shooter that promised innovative gameplay mechanics and a unique story involving time travel across different eras, from ancient Greece to futuristic Japan. Players would wield the powerful Daikatana sword, which could manipulate time and shape the story's outcome. On paper, it sounded like a game changer, especially for the time, but trouble began early in development. The game's engine, Quake 2, quickly became outdated as newer technology emerged, forcing the team to rebuild much of the game from scratch. This delayed the game by years, and by the time Daikatana finally released in 2000, it was graphically and mechanically behind the curve. What was once cutting edge had become old news in the fast-moving gaming industry at the time. Marketing for Daikatana didn't help either. One infamous ad campaign featured the bold tagline, "John Romero's about to make you his bitch." It was an aggressive, overconfident message that turned off many potential players and ended up just creating negative buzz around the game. By the time the game hit the market, expectations were sky high, but Daikatana couldn't live up to the hype. When players finally did get their hands on it, they were greeted with clunky controls, poor AI, and dated graphics. Reviews were harsh, criticizing the game for its uninspired level design and frustrating gameplay mechanics, particularly the AI companions who were notorious for getting stuck or dying repeatedly. What was supposed to be a genre-defying experience ended up feeling like a relic of the past. Daikatana was a commercial disaster, selling poorly and damaging Romero's reputation for years to come. While the game had ambitious ideas, its troubled development and overblown marketing campaign turned it into a high-profile failure. It serves as a reminder that even the biggest names in the industry can stumble when ambition outpaces execution. Up next, Too Human. Too Human was an ambitious action RPG developed by Silicon Knights and published by Microsoft, originally released in 2008. The game aimed to deliver a unique blend of Norse mythology and futuristic sci-fi elements, set in a world where cybernetically enhanced gods fought to protect humanity. The concept sounded intriguing, and expectations were high, as Too Human had been in development for almost a decade. Unfortunately, the game's troubled development history and ultimate release left much to be desired. Too Human was first announced in the late 1990s as a PlayStation game, before transitioning to the Nintendo GameCube, and finally ending up as an Xbox 360 exclusive. Throughout its development, Too Human underwent numerous delays, engine changes, and redesigns. By the time it was released, the gaming landscape had changed significantly, and many of the mechanics that had once seemed innovative were now outdated. The game was built using Epic Games' Unreal Engine 3, but this decision led to a highly publicized legal battle between Silicon Knights and Epic Games. Silicon Knights sued Epic, claiming that they had failed to provide adequate support for the engine, which they said contributed to Too Human's delays. In response, Epic countersued, accusing Silicon Knights of using their engine without permission. This legal battle further complicated the game's troubled development and tarnished its reputation even before it released. When Too Human finally hit store shelves, it received mixed to negative reviews. The game's combat system, which relied heavily on a twin-stick control scheme for melee attacks, was one of its most criticized aspects. Many players found the controls unintuitive and frustrating, making combat feel clunky and unsatisfying. The repetitive nature of the gameplay didn't help either, as players were often required to grind through the same types of enemies and environments environments with little variety. The story, while ambitious, also failed to resonate with players. The mix of Norse mythology and futuristic elements felt disjointed, and the game's narrative was often seen as confusing or underdeveloped. The game had promised deep RPG element, but many felt that its customization and progression systems just lacked depth, leaving players with little motivation to continue. Despite its shortcomings, Too Human had been envisioned as the first game in a planned trilogy. However, due to its poor reception and sales, those plans were quickly scrapped. The legal battle between Silicon Knights and Epic Games also ended in disaster for Silicon Knights, as they were ordered to destroy all unsold copies of Too Human after losing the case. This effectively erased the game from the digital marketplace, making it difficult for anyone to play the game today. No Man's Sky is a game that tells a story of one of the most infamous launches in gaming history, followed by one of the most remarkable comebacks. Developed by Hello Games, it was originally released in August 2016 with sky-high expectations. The game promised players a procedurally generated universe with 18 quintillion planets, each unique and explorable. Players could discover alien species, mine resources, trade, and even engage in space battle. The marketing hyped it up as a vast, near infinite sandbox. But upon launch, No Man's Sky quickly became a symbol of over-promising and under-delivering. When No Man's Sky first hit the shelves, many players were excited to dive into its expansive universe, but disappointment quickly set in. One of the biggest issues was that the game lacked many of the key features that had been teased in trailers and interviews. Multiplayer, for example, was almost non-existent, despite claims that players could potentially encounter each other in this massive universe. This led to widespread backlash, as players felt misled by the game's marketing. While the game did feature an enormous universe, many found it repetitive with little to do after the initial thrill of discovery wore off. No Man's Sky also suffered from technical problems. Many players experienced crashes, performance issues, and bugs that made the game difficult to enjoy, especially on PC. The game's procedural generation, which was supposed to create diverse and interesting worlds, often resulted in planets that felt barren and lifeless, leading to a sense of monotony. Critics and players alike were vocal in their disappointment, and No Man's Sky became a lightning rod for criticism. It was a harsh fall for Hello Games, a small studio that had dreamed big but failed to deliver on its initial promises. Sean Murray, the lead developer, became the focus of much of the anger, and Hello Games largely went silent after the launch, avoiding public appearances as they worked to improve the game. However, unlike many games that have stumbled at launch, No Man's Sky didn't stay down. Over the next few years, Hello Games dedicated itself to turning things around. Instead of just abandoning the project, the team began releasing a series of free updates that slowly transformed the game into the experience that they originally had promised. One of the first major updates, the Foundation update, introduced base building, new game modes, and improvements to the game's mechanics. This was just the beginning. Subsequent updates added a slew of new features. The Pathfinder update improved visuals, introduced vehicles, and added multiplayer features, which continued to evolve over time. The next update, released in 2018, was perhaps the most transformative, adding true multiplayer, third-person perspective, and major overhauls to the game system. Over time, No Man's Sky went from being a lonely, repetitive experience to a game that offered rich, varied gameplay. As of 2024, No Man's Sky has received over a dozen major updates, including Beyond, which added VR support and expanded multiplayer, and Origins, which introduced new biomes, creatures, and more planetary diversity. Players now have the ability to explore vast underwater environments, build intricate bases, form communities with other players, and take part in deep space expedition. The redemption arc of No Man's Sky is often cited as one of the best examples of how a game can turn around after a disastrous launch. Today, it has a dedicated player base, and many of the original promises have been fulfilled, if not exceeded. Hello Games stuck with the project, listened to player feedback, and transformed No Man's Sky into a rich, expansive experience that continues to grow. Aliens Colonial Marines. Aliens Colonial Marines was supposed to be a dream come true for fans of the Aliens franchise. Announced in 2006 and released in 2013, the game was developed by Gearbox Software and published by Sega. It promised to deliver a thrilling first-person shooter experience set in the Aliens universe, with players taking on the role of Colonial Marines battling the infamous Xenomorphs. However, what fans received was a game riddled with technical problems, poor design choices, and a massive gap between what was promised and what was delivered. The game had a long and troubled development cycle. Originally announced in 2006, Aliens Colonial Marines went through numerous delays, and the development process was plagued by outsourcing. Gearbox reportedly passed much of the development work to outside studios while focusing on their other major projects, such as Borderlands 2. This lack of direct oversight contributed to the game's disjointed feel and incomplete state at launch. One of the biggest issues was the misleading marketing. Demos shown at gaming conventions featured high-quality visuals and intense atmospheric gameplay, leading fans to believe they were getting an authentic Aliens experience. However, the final product was far from what had been promised. Upon release, players were greeted with downgraded graphics, clunky controls, and questionable AI, especially for the Xenomorphs, which were the game's main selling point. The Xenomorphs, which were supposed to be terrifying, intelligent predators, often behaved erratically, getting stuck in the environment or failing to engage players effectively. The story also failed to resonate with fans of the Alien series. While it was billed as a direct sequel to Aliens and Alien 3, the plot was riddled with inconsistencies and underwhelming writing. Players found it hard to care about the characters, and the overall narrative felt lackluster, especially when compared to the intense character-driven stories of the films. Another major issue was the technical performance. Aliens Colonial Marines was plagued by bugs, glitches, and poor optimization across all platforms. Frame rate drops, texture pop-ins, and other graphical issues were common, making the game feel unpolished and unfinished. These technical shortcomings only compounded the frustrations players had with the game's already lackluster design and gameplay. The multiplayer component, which had the potential to salvage some of the experience, also fell short. While it allowed players to battle xenomorphs and marines in PvP modes, the imbalance between the factions and the game's general lack of polish meant that the multiplayer failed to retain players for long. Perhaps the most infamous aspect of Aliens Colonial Marines was the discovery of a single typo in the game's AI code, which, when corrected by modders after release, significantly improved the behavior of the xenomorphs. This revelation only added to the perception that the game had been rushed out the door without adequate testing or quality control. Despite the massive fan interest and the strength of the Aliens brand, Aliens Colonial Marines was a commercial and critical disaster. It received overwhelmingly negative reviews, with critics and players alike slamming it for its poor gameplay, broken AI, and disappointing visuals. The game was widely considered one of the biggest gaming failures of the decade, and it did significant damage to Gearbox Software's reputation at the time. Duke Nukem Forever. Duke Nukem Forever is one of the most notorious games in history, not just because of its failure, but because of its incredibly long and troubled development. Originally announced in 1997 as a sequel to Duke Nukem 3D, the game became infamous for its constant delays, shifting between multiple engines, and passing through the hands of different developers before finally being released in 2011. After 14 years of development, what should have been a triumphant return for an iconic gaming character turned out to be a colossal disappointment. The game's development was nothing short of chaotic. Duke Nukem Forever was developed under 3D Realms, but they struggled to keep the project on track. The game was initially built using the Quake 2 engine, but was later moved to the Unreal Engine. Each switch in technology meant scrapping significant portions of the game and starting over, which further delayed the release. The game's scope also ballooned out of control, with new features and content being added constantly, preventing the team from ever reaching a finished product. Eventually, after over a decade of delays, financial problems led to 3D Realms downsizing and development stalling completely. Gearbox Software stepped in and acquired the rights to Duke Nukem Forever in 2010, finally pushing the game over the finish line for release in 2011. However, the long development cycle had not been kind to the game. When Duke Nukem Forever launched, it was met with overwhelmingly negative reviews. The game felt dated both in its design and its humor. What was once seen as edgy in the late 90s came across as crass and juvenile by 2011 standards. The gameplay too felt stuck in the past, with outdated mechanics, poor level design, and a lack of innovation. The once revolutionary character of Duke Nukem now seemed like a relic of a bygone era. Graphically, the game was unimpressive, especially considering the massive advancements in video game technology that occurred during its extended development. The visuals looked old, the animations were clunky, and the overall presentation was lackluster. Players and critics alike pointed out that the game felt like it had been pulled from the early 2000s, with very little polish to bring it up to modern standards. The game's attempts to lean into nostalgia weren't enough to save it. While there were nods to the original Duke Nukem 3D scattered throughout, the gameplay itself was uninspired and repetitive. The shooting mechanics were basic, and the level design felt linear. While Duke Nukem Forever eventually made it to the store shelves after a decade and a half of development, it was clear that the game had missed its window. By the time it was released, both the industry and players had already moved on. What was once seen as a groundbreaking series had become a parody of itself, and the game quickly faded into obscurity. Now let's talk about Fallout 76. Fallout 76 was released in November 2018, marking Bethesda's first attempt at creating an online multiplayer experience in the beloved Fallout franchise. Set in a massive open world, Fallout 76 promised players the ability to explore the post-apocalyptic wasteland of West Virginia with friends or other players, scavenging, building, and surviving together. However, what was meant to be a new and exciting evolution for the series quickly turned into a disaster at launch, with a long list of issues that severely damaged its reputation. One of the most significant problems Fallout 76 faced was its lack of meaningful content. While the open world was vast and beautifully rendered, it felt empty. The game had no human NPCs, a departure from previous Fallout titles known for their rich character-driven stories. Instead, quests were delivered through robots, holotapes, and terminals, which led to the world feeling lifeless and disconnected. Players were left wandering a massive map, often with little motivation to complete the repetitive fetch quests and exploration tasks the game offered. On top of this, Fallout 76 suffered from serious technical issues. Bugs were incredibly common, there were game-breaking glitches, and performance problems like frequent crashing, graphical issues, and server instability. All these issues made the online experience more frustrating than fun. Another point of criticism was the multiplayer focus. Many Fallout fans had come to love the series for its single-player experience. Rich storylines, deep role-playing mechanics, mechanics and complex characters. The shift to a multiplayer-focused online-only game alienated a significant portion of the fan base. For many, the experience felt shallow compared to previous entries, with the absence of meaningful interactions and moral choices that had defined the series. The game's launch also didn't come without controversy, most notably the infamous Collector's Edition debacle. Bethesda advertised a premium Power Armor Edition that was supposed to include a high-quality canvas bag. However, when customers received the edition, they found the bag was made from cheap nylon, leading to a major backlash. This PR blunder only added fuel to the already growing discontent around Fallout 76. Despite the initial disappointment, Bethesda did not abandon the game. Over the years, the studio worked hard to turn things around. Several major updates have been released since launch, addressing many of the game's most significant problems. The Wastelanders update in particular introduced human NPCs back into the game, along with new storylines, factions, and dialogue options, bringing the game closer to the traditional Fallout experience that fans had expected. Bethesda had continued to improve the game's performance, fix bugs, and introduce new content, turning Fallout 76 into a more enjoyable and complete experience. Today, Fallout 76 is a much more polished game, with a dedicated player base and regular content updates. While it may never fully shake off the shadow of its disastrous launch, the game has evolved significantly and found its footing as a long-term live service title. For the players that stuck with it, Fallout 76 has become a testament to how a game can improve with time and effort. Up next, let's talk about the original release of Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XIV was released in September 2010, and it was expected to be a major entry in the long-running Final Fantasy series. As the second MMORPG in the franchise following the success of Final Fantasy XI, Final Fantasy XIV promised an expansive online world for players to explore with their friends. However, what followed was a launch so disastrous that Square Enix made the unprecedented decision to essentially scrap the entire game, and they chose to rebuild it from the ground up. At launch, one of the most obvious problems with Final Fantasy XIV was its complicated and clunky interface. The game was difficult to navigate, and simple tasks such as equipping items or managing your inventory required an absurd number of clicks and menus. This made the game feel tedious and frustrating, even when trying to complete basic tasks. The world design, while visually impressive, was often described as lifeless. The environments were large but repetitive, and many players felt that the game lacked the depth and vibrancy of other MMOs on the market at the time. The lack of content was another major issue. Players quickly found themselves with little to do outside of grinding, and the quests that were available were poorly designed and repetitive. Another criticism of Final Fantasy XIV was the game's economy and crafting system. The in-game market was unstable, and the crafting system was overly complicated and unrewarding. Gathering resources often felt like a chore, and many players complained about the game's punishing mechanics that made even simple activities a hassle. Another glaring issue for Final Fantasy XIV was performance issues. The game was just built on an engine that wasn't optimized for online play. And funny enough, the game simply just looked too good. For an MMO, the engine could not handle the online play along with the assets the developers were using to create the world. And as a result of these issues, the overall performance was subpar, even for players with high-end hardware. The backlash was swift and brutal. Critics and players alike slammed the game for its poor design, technical issues, and lack of meaningful content. Square Enix quickly realized that the game was beyond saving in its current form. In an unusual move, they issued a public apology, acknowledging the game's shortcomings and pledging to fix it. However, the fixes required more than just a few patches. Final Fantasy XIV needed a complete overhaul. In 2012, Square Enix made the bold decision to shut down the original version of Final Fantasy XIV. The result was a new game, Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn, which launched in 2013 to much greater success. The developers even decided to write the game's failure into the lore of Final Fantasy XIV, sending the Red Moon Dalamud down into the game's world, literally and figuratively destroying it. The rebuilt game featured a streamlined interface, a more polished world, and significantly improved performance. A Realm Reborn became a massive success and is now one of the most popular and critically acclaimed MMORPGs on the market, with regular expansions and updates that continue to grow its player base. Mighty No. 9. Mighty No. 9 was one of the most anticipated crowdfunded games when it was first announced in 2013. Developed by Concept and helmed by Keiji Inafune, the creator of Mega Man, the game was pitched as a spiritual successor to the beloved Mega Man series. Fans were excited to see Inafune return to his roots with a 2D action platformer, and the Kickstarter campaign for Mighty No. 9 was wildly successful, raising over $4 million. However, the game's eventual release in 2016 was a major disappointment, and Mighty No. 9 became a cautionary tale about the dangers of overpromising in a crowdfunded project. From the start, Mighty No. 9 ran into problems. After a series of delays and communication issues with backers, fans began to grow frustrated. The game was initially promised for release in 2015, but was delayed multiple times, with the developers citing the need for more polish and improvements. However, when the game finally launched, it became clear that Mighty No. 9 had not lived up to the hype. The game was criticized for outdated visuals and graphics that looked far less polished than what had been shown in early promotional material, with simplistic designs and underwhelming effects. The art style, which was supposed to capture the charm of classic Mega Man games felt uninspired and bland, especially considering the amount of funding the game had received. Players expected a vibrant, modern take on the action platformer genre, but what they got felt more like a budget title. The gameplay too failed to deliver. While Mighty No. 9 stayed true to its roots as a side-scrolling platformer, the controls felt clunky, and the level design was criticized for being repetitive and uninspired. Many players felt that the game lacked the tight, satisfying mechanics that made Mega Man such a beloved series. Boss fights, a staple of Mega Man-style games, were also criticized for being overly simplistic and failing to offer the challenge that fans had hoped for. Unfortunately, many players did experience bugs, crashes, and performance issues, especially on the console versions of the game. The launch was just a mess, with some backers reporting that they hadn't received their promised rewards or digital copies of the game. Adding to the disappointment was a poorly received trailer released shortly before launch. The trailer, which made light of anime fans and used cringeworthy humor, further alienated the game's target audience. It left many fans feeling like the developers were out of touch with the very people who had funded the project in the first place. Mighty No. 9 was met with overwhelmingly negative reviews upon release. Critics and players felt like the game failed to live up to its potential, especially given the reputation of its creator and the excitement surrounding its Kickstarter campaign. While Mighty No. 9 was supposed to revive the spirit of Mega Man, it ended up tarnishing the legacy of both Inafune and the crowdfunding model. Despite its strong start on Kickstarter, the game's failure left many backers feeling burned. Up next, Haze. Haze, developed by Free Radical Design and published by Ubisoft, was released in 2008 as a PlayStation 3 exclusive. The game was billed as a first-person shooter that would challenge genre conventions with its unique setting and narrative themes. Set in a dystopian future, players would take on the role of Shane Carpenter, a soldier working for a mega corporation that supplied troops with a drug called Nectar, which enhanced their abilities in battle. Despite this interesting premise, Haze quickly became one of the most infamous flops in the gaming industry. When Haze was first announced, there was significant buzz surrounding the game. Free Radical Design had developed Time Splitters, a beloved first-person shooter series, and fans expected Haze to carry the same level of creativity and polish. The game was promoted as a PlayStation 3 exclusive that would showcase the power of the console, and the devs even positioned Haze as a potential Halo killer, which only added to the expectations. However, when the game finally launched in 2008, it was immediately clear that Haze had fallen short. One of the game's biggest problems was technical performance. Haze suffered from poor graphics, muddy textures, and uninspired environments. The game's frame rate was also inconsistent, leading to choppy gameplay, which made the experience feel very sluggish. For a game that was marketed as a high-profile exclusive, these issues were glaring. The gameplay itself was another area where Haze failed to deliver. The core mechanic of using Nectar to boost the player's abilities could have been an interesting twist, but in practice it felt underwhelming. The combat and weapons were generic and enemy encounters felt repetitive. The game's AI was poorly designed and enemies often acted unpredictably or failed to present any real challenge. The narrative, which did have the potential to explore thought-provoking themes about the use of drugs and warfare and the morality of corporate control, ended up falling flat and predictable. Players quickly discovered that the story was shallow, with little character development and cliché dialogue. But despite the single-player shortcomings, there was the multiplayer aspect, which was supposed to be a significant component of Haze. Unfortunately, that also fell short. The game offered standard multiplayer modes, but lacked the depth or innovation needed to stand out in a crowded market. With bugs, connection issues, and a lack of post-launch support, it's further hampered the online experience, causing the potential multiplayer community to dwindle shortly after launch. The game's poor reception was a major blow to Free Radical Design, which was already struggling financially. Not long after Haze's release, the studio was acquired by Crytek, and many of the original developers left the company. Now let's talk about Crackdown 3. Crackdown 3 was one of Microsoft's most anticipated Xbox exclusives, first announced in 2014. As the long-awaited sequel to the popular Crackdown series, fans were excited for the return of the over-the-top, open-world action gameplay that had made the original game such a hit. What set Crackdown 3 apart from its predecessors was its promise of revolutionary destruction mechanics powered by cloud computing, which would allow players to level entire cities in multiplayer. However, after years of delays and changes in development, Crackdown 3 launched in 2019, and it quickly became clear that the game had failed to live up to its lofty promises. Crackdown 3 suffered through a very extended development time. Originally slated for a 2016 release, the game was delayed multiple times, which led to growing skepticism among fans. The delays were attributed to technical challenges, particularly with the much-hyped cloud-powered destruction in multiplayer. While this feature was meant to be the game's centerpiece, it struggled to materialize in a way that met expectations. By the time the game finally launched, many players had already lost interest. When Crackdown 3 did release, the reception was lukewarm at best. The game's single-player campaign felt like a throwback to early earlier open-world games, but not in a good way. While the classic Crackdown gameplay of jumping around, collecting orbs, and causing chaos was still present, the game lacked innovation. The world design felt empty and repetitive, with little to do outside of the core missions. Players quickly grew bored of the rinse-and-repeat structure of clearing out enemy strongholds and defeating bosses. For a game that had been in development so long, Crackdown 3 looked dated, with simplistic textures and character models. The visual style, while colorful, lacked the polish that players had come to expect from modern open-world titles. It didn't help that the destruction mechanics, which had been the focal point of the game's marketing, were severely toned down in the single-player mode, leaving players with a standard open-world experience. The multiplayer mode, called Wrecking Zone, did feature some of the cloud-based destruction mechanics that had been promised, but it wasn't nearly as groundbreaking as many had hoped. The destruction felt more like a gimmick than a central gameplay mechanic. With few game modes and minimal post-launch support, the multiplayer component quickly faded from relevance. Despite the return of actor Terry Crews as a playable character and the charm of the original series DNA, Crackdown 3 failed to impress both critics and players. Brink. Developed by Splash Damage and published by Bethesda, Brink was released in 2011 as a multiplayer-focused first-person shooter. The game was set in a dystopian future where two factions, the Resistance and Security, fought for control of a floating city called the Ark. Brink promised to blend parkour-style movement with team-based objectives, and it was billed as a revolutionary shooter that would offer a fresh, tactical experience. However, despite the innovative ideas and hype surrounding its release, Brink quickly became a commercial and critical disappointment. One of the most talked about features of Brink leading up to its release was its parkour movement system, known as SMART, smooth movement across random terrain. This system allowed players to vault over obstacles, slide under barriers, and generally move fluidly through the environment. The idea was to create a fast-paced, dynamic experience that would set Brink apart from other shooters on the market. Unfortunately, while the movement system worked in theory, it didn't feel smooth or intuitive in practice. Players found the parkour elements clunky, and the maps were often poorly designed to accommodate the free-flowing movement the game advertised. Brink also emphasized team-based gameplay, with players taking on different roles, such as medics, engineers, and soldiers to complete objectives. However, the lack of communication tools and the game's poor matchmaking system made it difficult to coordinate with your teammates, especially in public matches. Without proper teamwork, Brink quickly developed into a chaotic, uncoordinated battle where players focused on racking up kills rather than completing objectives. This led to frustration among players who were expecting a more tactical experience. The game was also hindered by technical performance, especially on consoles, and fundamentally, the multiplayer was flawed thanks to the game's netcode. These issues led to lag and connection issues that made multiplayer matches frustrating. These issues, combined with a lackluster gameplay experience, made it very difficult for Brink to hold on to players after its launch. The game's progression system, which was designed to reward players with new abilities and customization options, also felt underwhelming. While Brink offered a variety of ways to customize your character, the actual impact of these upgrades was minimal at best. Players didn't feel a meaningful sense of progression, and the gameplay loop quickly became repetitive. Brink was in heavy need of post-launch support, but the game received minimal updates, and Bethesda's attempts to release downloadable content failed to reignite player interest. With a dwindling player base and no significant updates to fix the core issues, Brink's multiplayer community rapidly declined, and the game faded into obscurity. Alright, let's talk about Command & Conquer 4. Command & Conquer 4 Tiberian Twilight was released in 2010 by EA as the final entry in the beloved Command & Conquer series, which had been a staple in the real-time strategy genre for over a decade. The game was meant to conclude the long-running Tiberium storyline, which had spanned multiple titles in the franchise. However, rather than going out on a high note, Tiberian Twilight was met with disappointment and backlash from fans, leading it to be considered one of the most significant missteps in the series. One of the main reasons for the game's failure was the drastic shift in gameplay mechanics. Unlike previous Command & Conquer games, Tiberian Twilight abandoned the traditional base building and resource management mechanics that had defined the franchise. Instead, it introduced a more streamlined approach focused on mobile bases known as crawlers, which could be deployed and moved around on the battlefield. While this was intended to innovate and modernize the RTS formula, it alienated longtime fans who enjoyed the strategic depth of building and managing their bases. The decision to move away from resource collection also changed the pace and feel of the game. In previous titles, gathering Tiberium was a core part of the strategy, forcing players to carefully balance offense and defense while expanding their territory. By removing this mechanic, Tiberian Twilight felt less like a Command & Conquer game and more like a simplified, action-oriented RTS that lacked the depth and complexity fans had come to expect from the series. Another issue was the game's focus on multiplayer at the expense of the single-player experience. Tiberian Twilight introduced an always online requirement, even for single-player campaigns, which was frustrating for many players, especially those with unreliable internet connections. The multiplayer-centric design also meant that the single-player campaign felt underdeveloped, had a weak storyline, lackluster missions, and minimal narrative depth. This was a significant letdown, as previous Command & Conquer games were known for their engaging, over-the-top campaigns, filled with memorable characters and live-action cutscenes. The story itself, which was supposed to conclude the epic Tiberium saga, left left many fans unsatisfied. The plot was convoluted and key storylines from previous games were either ignored or just poorly resolved. The introduction of new characters felt forced, and the ending of the game failed to deliver the kind of dramatic payoff that players had been hoping for since the original Tiberium titles. On top of these gameplay and narrative issues, Tiberium Twilight also suffered from more technical problems, particularly in multiplayer matches. Players also complained about the game's visuals. While they were serviceable, they didn't stand out in the way that earlier Command & Conquer titles had, further contributing to the sense that this final entry was a rushed and underwhelming conclusion to the series. Command & Conquer 4 not only failed to satisfy longtime players, but it also effectively ended the franchise on a bad note, with no major releases in the series since. Speaking of always online only requirements, we're going to talk about Diablo 3. Diablo 3, developed by Blizzard Entertainment, was one of the most highly anticipated games of 2012. As the follow-up to the critically acclaimed Diablo 2, fans had high expectations for the next installment in the iconic action RPG series. The game promised fast-paced combat, endless loot, and the dark gothic atmosphere that had defined the franchise. However, despite its initial excitement, Diablo 3 became infamous for its controversial always-only requirement and the issues that plagued its launch. When Diablo 3 released in May 2012, it quickly became clear that the always-online aspect was a major problem. Even for players who wanted to experience the game's single-player campaign, they were required to have a constant internet connection. Blizzard implemented this system to support features like the real money auction house and to prevent cheating and piracy. However, the decision led to chaos during the launch window. The game's servers were overwhelmed by the massive influx of players, and many weren't able to log into the game at all. The infamous Error 37 message became a meme among frustrated players, as countless fans were locked out of the game for extended periods. This server instability and inability to play a game that they had waited years for left many feeling angry or disappointed. For a franchise with such a dedicated single-player fan base, the always online requirement felt unnecessary and intrusive. Beyond the connectivity issues, Diablo 3 also faced criticism for the introduction of the real money auction house. The auction house allowed players to buy and sell in-game items using either in-game gold or real-world money. The feature quickly became controversial, as it undermined one of the core appeals of the Diablo series, the thrill of finding powerful loot through gameplay. Players could simply just buy the best items instead of earning them, which disrupted the balance of the game. Many felt that the auction house turned Diablo 3 into a pay-to-win experience. Gameplay-wise, Diablo 3 was still an enjoyable action RPG, with fast-paced combat, a range of character classes, and a massive world to explore. However, the initial launch experience was tainted by the technical problems in the auction house controversy. For many, the game felt like a step backwards compared to its predecessor Diablo 2, which was beloved for its offline play and focus on rewarding loot systems. Blizzard quickly acknowledged the problems and began working to improve the game. Over the next few months, patches were released to address server issues and improve the game's balance. But it wasn't until 2014, with the release of the Reaper of Souls expansion, that Diablo 3 truly began to win back its player base. In a crucial move, Blizzard also removed the real money auction house in 2014, a decision that was met with widespread praise. Through these changes in support, Blizzard helped revitalize Diablo 3 and brought many players back into the game. 1982's E.T. E.T. the extraterrestrial for the Atari 2600 is often remembered as one of the biggest failures in video game history, and a symbol of the video game Crash of 1983. Released in December 1982, E.T. was based on the hugely successful film of the same name. Atari was eager to capitalize on the movie's popularity and rushed the game's development to ensure it would be ready for the holiday season. Unfortunately, this rush to market resulted in one of the most infamous video game disasters of all time. The development of E.T. was handled by a single programmer, Howard Scott Warshaw, who had just 5 weeks to design and complete the entire game. Typically, games took several months or even longer to develop, but Atari pushed for a quick turnaround to meet the holiday deadline. Warshaw, who had previously developed the successful Raiders of the Lost Ark game, did his best to create an engaging experience under intense time constraints. However, the result was a game that many considered to be unplayable. The gameplay in E.T. was simple but frustrating. Players controlled the character E.T., who was tasked with collecting pieces of an interplanetary phone to call home. The game was plagued with poor controls and unclear objectives, with many players struggling to understand what they were even supposed to do. One of the most notorious aspects of the game was its frequent use of pits, into which E.T. would constantly fall. Getting out of these pits was a tedious process, and this repetitive, frustrating gameplay left many players feeling angry and disappointed. Although the game had the E.T. name attached to it, and Atari hoped for strong sales, E.T. was a commercial disaster. Many players returned the game to stores, leading to a significant financial loss for Atari. The game's poor reception and the massive overproduction of cartridges, Atari had manufactured millions of copies, expecting E.T. to be a blockbuster, led to unsold inventory piling up. This, combined with other factors like the oversaturation of the video game market and poor quality games flooding stores, contributed to what is now known as the video game crash of 1983. The failure of E.T. became legendary when it was revealed that Atari had disposed of hundreds of thousands of unsold cartridges by burying them in a landfill in New Mexico. For years, this story was regarded as an urban legend, but in 2014, an excavation of the site confirmed the truth. Thousands of E.T. cartridges were unearthed, cementing the game's place in video game history. Agents of Mayhem. Developed by Volition and published by Deep Silver, Agents of Mayhem was released in 2017, with the goal of building on the success of the studio's Saint Row series. Set in the same universe as Saints Row, Agents of Mayhem introduced a new cast of characters and shifted to a team-based third-person shooter format, where players could switch between different agents with unique abilities. Despite its connection to Saints Row and some promising concepts, Agents of Mayhem failed to capture the attention of players and quickly faded into obscurity. One of the key reasons for Agents of Mayhem's failure was its lack of identity. While it was marketed as a spiritual successor to Saints Row, the game didn't have the same level of charm or irreverent humor that fans had come to love. Instead, it felt like a watered-down version of what made Saints Row great. The new cast of agents, while diverse in their abilities, lacked the memorable personalities and outrageous antics that defined Saints Row. Without a compelling story or strong character development, players found it hard to connect with the game's world or its characters. The gameplay, while fun in short bursts, quickly became repetitive. Agents of Mayhem featured an open world set in a futuristic version of Seoul, South Korea, but the city felt lifeless and empty. The mission design didn't help matters. Many of the objectives involved little more than clearing out waves of enemies or destroying objects, with little variety or creativity in how missions were structured. The lack of meaningful content and variety made the game feel like a grind, which quickly wore out its welcome for many players. Another issue was the game's reliance on its hero switching mechanic. While the ability to swap between different agents with unique abilities was one of the game's main selling points, the execution felt underdeveloped. Players could switch between 3 different agents during missions, but the gameplay didn't fully take advantage of this feature. Many players ended up sticking to their favorite agents, rendering the team-based aspect of the game somewhat pointless. Performance-wise, Agents of Mayhem also struggled at launch. Players reported various bugs, glitches, and performance issues, especially on consoles. While the game wasn't unplayable, the technical problems added to the frustration and contributed to the overall perception that the game lacked polish. From a marketing standpoint, Agents of Mayhem also suffered. The game was released during a crowded period for third-person shooters, and it struggled to stand out in a competitive market. Agents of Mayhem just never managed to carve out its own niche. The connection to Saints Row wasn't enough to draw in fans, and the game's attempt to create its own identity ultimately fell flat. That's all the failed video games we have for you today. Make sure you subscribe to Save Point and like the video if you enjoyed. Let us know down in the comments what you'd like to see next. See you in the next one.